One could argue that for many Americans, especially those of a certain age, most of what they know about the history of tariffs comes from a movie, the 1986 film Ferris Bueller's Day Off.
In 1930, the Republican-controlled House of Representatives, in an effort to alleviate the effects of the, anyone? The Great Depression, passed the, anyone? A tariff bill, the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, which, anyone raised or lowered? Raised tariffs in an effort to collect more revenue for the federal government.
The actual history is even more interesting than Ben Stein's character and those students certainly made it out to be. Here to tell us all about the history of tariffs is Douglas Irwin. He is a professor of economics at Dartmouth. He worked on trade policy in Ronald Reagan's Council of Economic Advisors. Professor Irwin, welcome. The first question I guess I would put to you is, give us a sense of what do Trump's proposed tariffs look like in comparison in historical terms? Now, when I say proposed tariffs, I know they switch on and off all the time, and who knows where they'll be by tomorrow morning. But I mean, broadly speaking, the numbers he's used, 25% against Canada and Mexico, 10 to 20% against China, assume that we're in that ballpark. What does that look like historically?
Well, if you look at the history of U.S. tariffs, particularly over the last century, it's a true outlier. It would bring them up to levels we haven't seen since the 1940s, not quite as high as Smoot-Hawley in that clip that you just showed, which ultimately reached 60%. But it would push things up to about 20%, and that's because we're hitting two of our largest trading partners, Canada and Mexico, ostensibly with 25% tariffs.
And it's fair to say, as you say, the chart, when you look at of tariffs over the last century, particularly since the end of the World War II, is really one of very significant downward movement. You know, we've moved, the whole world has moved into a free trade world. And fair to say that it has coincided with massive prosperity around the world?
Absolutely. Not only has U.S. income risen during this period quite dramatically, but particularly around the world. As countries have opened up to trade, and some came later, some came sooner, they've experienced tremendous gains in income, massive reduction in poverty, particularly in the 1980s and 90s when there was this Reagan move towards freer trade.
It also strikes me, Professor, that Trump sometimes talks about how we could use tariffs to replace the income tax, and that if you look at the math, that is kind of impossible. If you were to raise tariffs 10% on all goods coming into America, I think it would make up 5% or something like that of the federal government's revenues. Once you have a big welfare state that pays out Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, you can't possibly fund it through tariffs. Am I right? You have to use income taxes.
That's absolutely right. So there was a period when we could fund the federal government with tariffs alone, but that was before the Civil War, when government spending was only 2 or 3% of GDP. We didn't have a welfare state and transfer payments. We basically just had funding of national defense and the national debt from the Revolutionary War in earlier periods. So in that case, the tariff was raised about 90% of the federal government's revenue, and imports were the tax base of the economy. But after the Civil War, as the U.S. economy changed, as we had much greater government spending, and particularly after the introduction of the income tax, the share of revenue derived from the tariff has fallen to very low levels. It's only about 2% now. So the idea that we could balance the budget or even come close to that by taxing imports more, when imports actually are a relatively small share of U.S. GDP, a small share of the economy, is very difficult to achieve. So we unfortunately need income taxes and other taxes to balance our books if that's the way we want to move.
And when we put these tariffs on, other countries, it's become clear, will reciprocate. And then presumably Trump has said we would reciprocate to that. So there's a danger here. You end up in a tit-for-tat world. And in any case, once you put tariffs on, they're hard to take off, because now you've created a protected domestic industry that's used to having no foreign competition or very little foreign competition, right? So, I mean, this is likely to be a one-way ratchet that just moves tariffs up all over the world. What would be the consequence of that?
Well, I mean, it would be lower standards of living, I think, around the world because you'd be interfering with international trade, which is this conduit for the exchange of ideas, technology, cheaper goods. And you're absolutely right. When tariffs go up, they can go up very quickly, but bringing them down is a very slow process. So, for example, you know, the clip that you showed about Ferris Bueller talking about the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, which took tariffs to very high levels in the 1930s. It really took us until the 1990s to bring tariffs down to much lower levels. It was a very long, arduous process over many decades and a lot of international trade negotiations. It wasn't something that happened very quickly. And so once we put these tariffs in place, even if future administrations want to expand trade and cooperate more with our trading partners, it's going to be a long road to get back to where we were.
Douglas Irwin, thank you so much.
You're most welcome. Thank you.